Chapter 4. The Court at Buda. Now it was at Buda that forces seen and unseen were forging the destiny of Jadwiga and William. As they went back and forth between palace and church, followed their program of piety and study and play, those who watched the knightly youth and the promising girl, instead of saying, "There go the good comrades," were more apt to say, "There go Hungary's queen and king." For as the new decade got underway, Louis' subjects were thinking with anxiety about the succession. Despite his effort to cover failing health, the country watched him with alert concern, and he, far more troubled than they, strengthened his alliances. In August 1379, he had summoned Polish magnates to a meeting to reconsider the disposition of the Polish crown. He called them to the northern walled city of Kassa, where Hungary's Gothic cathedral stood, and where he had built, too, a palace to facilitate such conferences. To this pleasant city the arbiters of Poland's future came, but by no means single-mindedly. The powerful Archbishop of Gniezno, who ranked next to the king, and the nobles of Great Poland vigorously opposed Louis' plan to make his eldest daughter Mary their queen, while Dobislav, Castellan of Capitol Hill at Krakow, and nobles of the province of Small Poland, in which Krakow lay, even more strongly supported it. This conflict Louis handled in his characteristic manner. He shut Kassa gates, declaring that nobody would leave the town until the opposition was beaten. The delegates announced that Mary would succeed him in Poland. A few months later, at a meeting in the hunting castle at Zalim, Louis and the two Elizabeths and Leopold agreed that the marriage of William and Jadwiga would take place within a very short time. Then the king returned to Buda, there to push the education of his young people. No other capital in Europe presented a more stimulating natural setting than Buda. Paris on the Seine, London on the Thames, Venice on the Adriatic. These pleased, delighted the eye. But no other comprised Buda's dramatic conjunction of hills, river, and plain. Hungarians, after using first the lower site of Old Buda, later selected the height whose defensive walls still rise above the Danube. River water, strained into a reservoir, was carried up stairways within these walls to the castle above. Across the river, facing Buda, and connected with it by a bridge of boats, lay Pest. From the ramparts one watched the lowering light gilding towers and roofs. In the morning there were usually silvery mists, soft puffs of clouds above the Danube, sweeping, curving with the hills. And at certain times of the year billowy fog concealed it. The castle awakened to the rasping sounds of lifting bridge and portcullis, the clanking of armor being polished. Cackling geese and crowing cocks, barking dogs, heralded the change of guards. Halloos of boatmen drifted up from canoes and barges, and from the road the songs of pilgrim processions already underway. A part of the world was ever on foot or on horse, called by a shrine, a war, a crusade, a discovery of truth. Life offered one incentive after another to wandering. Thus was placed the Magyar court, Jadwiga's home, where she was being trained to be a queen. More than beauty was inherent in its geography. On the turbulent European scene fell the shadow of two empires, the Eastern, centered in Constantinople and drawing light from the Orthodox Church, and the Western, sustained by Rome and the papacy. Hungary held a position of balance between these two empires, which meant a constant challenge to her diplomatic skill. Just as the boy Louis had been a witness at meetings which represented the power and influence of the Hungarian state, so now Jadwiga watched her father, in splendid assembly, in momentous conference. He made her familiar with the etiquette of such occasions, and to the extent to which her quick mind could comprehend, explained what moved behind the scene. Louis gathered about him a complete hierarchy of nobles, many of whom he richly endowed, and about them in turn were grouped, in banderia, the military forces of the kingdom, each with its pennant. No other surpassed them in appearance when they gathered on important days. They were superior, too, in war. Their horses, said an admiring Italian observer, are accustomed to reign as their knights, whose long saddles serve as outdoor beds. They do not suffer from hunger in desert regions, for they carry in their bags a dry meat powder which, thrown into boiling water, suffices them. They excel in swiftness, in flight, shoot their arrows, and, turning abruptly, recommence the battle. They seek the greatest peril, disregard death. Magyar boatmen, too, were considered second only to the Venetians in dexterity. Louis' ships carried grain and minerals to Dalmatia, where they exchanged their cargoes for Asian spices and perfumes. They connected Hungary with that world of wonder and opportunity being opened up by the followers of Marco Polo, whose adventures thrilled the youth of the day. In the Neapolitan campaigns, the Hungarian nobility had been deeply impressed by Italian culture, whose influence was soon expressed in domestic architecture, and in the gardens and fresco painting and sculpture of their own country. This development Louis encouraged. He was ambitious to keep his capital abreast of Paris and the beauty-loving cities of Europe, especially of that luminous metropolis nearby Prague. Therefore, he called artists to Buda, not only from the workshops of Italy, but from those of France and Germany and farther away places, until from the combination of Magyar richness of color and design with more delicate Western forms, he achieved a background of varied beauty. In addition to the royal arms of Hungary, the crowned eagle and plumes, one saw everywhere the graceful Angevin device, the lily of France. It blossomed on crown and mantle, above gateways and doorways, on hangings and rugs that gave warmth to rugged halls. The palace shone with a wealth of gem-studded crosses and images, crystal bowls and gold cups, ivory toilet articles, silver table services. There were, too, linens of finest weave and handsomely carved furniture. Tables stood ready for games of dice and draughts. As we look back on Buda during this last quarter of 1300, we see Jadwiga, during her most impressionable years, growing up under the enriching influences of a widespread creative activity, amid surroundings of a splendor that perished with its age. The custom of lavish gift-giving stimulated artistic endeavor. Rarely was there an important occasion which omitted the presentation of handsome cups or other souvenirs. And King Louis gave not only within his own borders, but to faraway courts and churches. The chapel he built at Aachen, in memory of a victory over the Turks, treasured from him 3 Madonnas in silver frames carved with the Polish eagle, several gilded candlesticks, and 6 pieces of beautiful armor. Despite the richness of interiors, at Buda, as at Visegrad, guests were often welcomed out of doors. When, for instance, the year after the false marriage, the Scalas of Italy arrived for a visit, King Louis received them under a blue velvet tent, embroidered in gold and glittering with amethysts and pearls. Chairs inside the tent were inlaid with ivory and gold figures of animals and flowers. Above it were tree branches and birds. And the guests themselves were crowned with leaves as they entered. Even Italy, with its Doge's palace, lily tower, and blossoming of beauty that stirred the world, could scarcely have enhanced the picture. Was it surprising, then, that artists and poets and scholars whom Louis encouraged to come to Buda found it a sympathetic capital? This ardent son of the church ever welcomed, too, priest and friar. Chapel services were in progress almost continuously. He himself, people said, did between 200 and 300 Aves daily, and the princesses began early to emulate the king's example. Jadwiga, kneeling beside her marvelous father in the royal chapel, must have thought of God as almost as near. God ruled heaven and earth as her father ruled his dominions, only more gloriously. Across Europe, 14th century faith flowered in marvelous spires. They lifted from chapel and cloister music of religion, pointing from the uncertainty of terrestrial possessions to the certainty of celestial treasure. However long the arm of the Turk or of the Black Plague, twice pestilence had all but wiped out Louis's people. It could not reach the kingdom of heaven. Angels easily negotiated the airways between that heaven and earth. King Louis envied those who could live entirely in this mystical world. Louis's live interest stimulated the growth of schools and universities, as it did the progress of his own educational enterprise at court. Some of Hungary's schools, most were under control of the religious orders, awarded scholarships instead of degrees, so that one found Hungarian students at the University of Paris, at Oxford and Cologne, Vienna and Padua, and in exchange, students from these universities in Hungary. Among teachers whom the king brought to the university he founded at Pécs, and of whose progress he was proud, was the famous law professor Bettini of Bologna, whom he lavishly rewarded. Could he have looked forward as he planned for this university, and seen Jadwiga, this daughter so close to him, passionately laboring for another, what satisfaction would have been his? The arrival of a scholar or singer was always an event to the princesses and their fiancés. They plied such visitors with questions, asked for news of battles in France, where the 100 Years' War was dragging on its weary length, and where no one yet saw on the horizon the Maid of Orleans, soon to appear. For news of how things were going with young King Richard of England, not much older than they. For recitals of the fascinating tales of the poet Chaucer. They wished this tale-teller might be induced himself to come to Buda. They gleaned from painters and sculptors and other artists. Everywhere men were working for the sheer love of creating. Usually they did not sign their masterpieces, saying instead, "We do not want our names, but our works, to be written in the book of life." They were often in Scribe John of Aprod's study, where the chronicle of the reign was being written. Jadwiga's father encouraged such visits. He himself followed the writing of this record and the other bookmaking at court. Because of the perfection of their manuscripts, the silent Carthusian monks enjoyed his marked favor. He prized his own books, such beautiful examples as the Moral Reflections of Pope Gregory on Job, made for him at Visegrad by John Bredenshed, and a Psalter in Latin, German, and Polish, far more than gold and silver cups. Nor could he have been induced to part with his life of St. Ladislaus and that of Alexander the Great, today proudly preserved at Oxford. Again, our thoughts flash back to these interests of her father, when we see Jadwiga, later, writing with her own hand a translation of the New Testament. Among Jadwiga's instructors, none was more influential than the Bishop of Veszprém, Ladislaus de Mendi. One of the best educated men at court, an intimate friend of the family, and Queen Elizabeth's chancellor, he was at the same time her physician. He had, in fact, brought Jadwiga into the world, and for that successful delivery had been rewarded with a fine palace in Upper Hungary. The country had ardently hoped that this third child would be the long-looked-for male heir. At times powerful nobles had gone so far as to suggest that the king put away Elizabeth and take a wife on whom he might rely for sons. The Queen Mother herself once urged this course on her son, who reluctantly agreed to follow it. And Elizabeth, in the generosity of her love, had consented to a separation. She and Louis went sadly to Dalmatia together to establish there, at Zara, a monastery, before they parted. But as the severing weeks passed, they knew themselves more deeply in love than ever before, and when the Queen found that she was again pregnant, they retracted their promises and returned joyfully to Buda. Once, before a child was to be born, King Louis had made the long journey with his wife to Ragusa, there to pray before the holy relics of Saint Simeon for a male heir, but, as it proved, again without avail. It was at this time that rumor reported that the Queen had stolen a finger bone of the saint, to help her to the hoped-for delivery, but after a series of punitive illnesses had returned it. Whether she purloined the sacred finger or not, she did order made in Ragusa a more suitable casket in which to enshrine St. Simeon's body, a silver ark set with portrait plaques of the king and queen and their suites, which it took 4 years to complete. The Bishop of Veszprém must have recounted to Jadwiga the story of these disappointed hopes, adding that God would once again demonstrate his inscrutable wisdom, when, through her rule with William, the Hungarian people would win hitherto unknown glory and well-being. Scribe John was another favorite teacher. History lessons did not lag, especially from Mary. Referring to her enthusiasm, John, in dedicating a book to her, wrote, "One of the signs of an immortal soul is that it can see beyond its own boundaries." Besides history and geography and the scholastic grammar and rhetoric, there were languages to learn. To begin with, educated persons must know the international language, Latin. Zealous Christians aspired to go further. They wished to read the Psalms and other portions of the Scriptures in the original Hebrew. And to the future queens, Mary and Jadwiga, and to William and Sigismund, after Hungarian, German and Polish were of first importance, with Italian and French following close upon them. Jadwiga's German, as we know, was already well started. With the knowledge of French and Italian, what treasure of lyric and epic and romantic literature lay before one. Deprived indeed were those who had not read at least the choicest love songs of the troubadours, the knightly Arthurian romances, the writings of St. Francis, Dante's Divine Comedy, and Petrarch's sonnets. Polish was more difficult than these Latin tongues. King Louis himself had never taken the trouble to master the Poles language, a lack which did not lessen his difficulties as absentee king of their country. As they grew older, Jadwiga's and Mary's lessons included more than this program. The king honored in women simplicity in manners and appearance, proficiency in the arts, and in all that pertained to the management of the household, so that early Queen Elizabeth began their instruction in the duties of the menage. She was expert in embroidery, and her daughters loved to sit beside her, drawing their own designs, matching seed pearls and coral, and silk and metal threads. No visitor could please them more than by bringing them gifts of embroidery materials. Their mother superintended, too, their music lessons, occasionally supplementing them with exercises of her own invention. Those were prized hours, when, as a reward for a task well performed, accompanying herself on the lute, she sang to them songs, wild as the mountains and soft as the valleys of Bosnia. Sometimes she sang lilting tunes of her own Polish mother's country. She liked thinking of herself as half Polish. But aside from this intimate instruction, the queen exercised far less control over the education of her daughters than she might have had she possessed her mother-in-law's influence with the king or been endowed with the gifts and character of that old lady. Sometimes, it is true, the queen mother was criticized as too pleasure-loving, too temperamental to be entrusted with her responsibilities. But those who rightly measured her powers praised her for being more like a man than a woman in her independence and open-mindedness. They knew her to be the first woman in Hungary to have so large an influence in political and social affairs. She had been independent even of the Pope in politics, a fact which did not encourage the papal chroniclers to overestimate her abilities. Her court at Krakow was indeed one of the gayest in Europe. The Queen Regent at 75 still led the dance, but while she was listening to poets and singers, her cities, despite internal disorders, were thriving, and Poland's industry and trade were growing. That was her answer to critics. One chronicler, in summing up her qualities, said of her that she loved lusty gaiety, founded churches and convents, and read her breviary hard. It was just this combination of joie de vivre and religious fervor that made her so wonderful to her grandchildren. They were delighted when she came from Poland to spend the Christmas of 1380 with them. But alas, as Christmas approached, it was clear that she was so far from well that festivities were not to be thought of, and on December 29th, the queen wife and mother, who had been one of Europe's most picturesque figures during more than half a century, died. She who had thought nothing of starting forth with her carriage and 6 horses to cross the continent would travel no more. Neither young nor old could believe that this was true. It seemed impossible that such vitality should cease. People would continue to tell tales of her brilliant courts and spectacular excursions. How she had thrilled them when in 43, knowing her son Andrew in danger in Naples, she started in the gold coach for that kingdom, equipped with 27,000 gold marks by Louis, who all but emptied the Visegrad treasury to thus supply her. At Zara, in Dalmatia, he had arranged for 2 boats to meet her, and for 2 additional war boats contributed by Venice to conduct her farther to sea. The 27,000 marks soon dwindled, and Louis followed them by 4,000 more. But in Rome, then a city of 17,000 inhabitants, 14,000 of whom were reported beggars, these 2 melted so rapidly that the charitable Elizabeth was forced after 3 days to leave. She and her following made a vivid impression on the Italians, whose chronicle remarked that unlike the French, who usually made a scandalous clamor, the Hungarians were always praying and fingering their rosaries. The Latins had grown quickly fond of their royal guest and observing her maimed hand, while they admired her beautiful embroideries, asked how she had been able to achieve them, to which she replied cheerfully that she could now but direct the clever needles as she sat after luncheon with her ladies. When she went to St. Peter's to see the relics of St. Peter and St. Veronica's handkerchief, they spread a long carpet before the portal, and at the end of her brief visit, they saw her depart for Naples with regret. This independent Queen Mother could have requested that her body be laid in the royal burial place, the cathedral at Székesfehérvár, one of the architectural wonders of the world. But instead, she asked to be buried quietly in the chapel of the nuns of St. Clara at Buda, whose convent she had founded and supported. Thus she followed her individual desire to the end. As characteristic was her will, with its revelation of the warmth, the loyalty of her personal relationships, she bequeathed to her son Louis, the only one left of her immediate family, her most precious gold cups, among them a high wine goblet wrought with the figure of St. Ladislaus and the arms of Hungary and Poland, a gift from Naples. She gave Elizabeth her castle in Old Buda, her jewels, and her first prayer book. Mary received a gold chain ornamented with 2 eagles, and Jadwiga another jeweled chain and a crown encircled with lilies of France. Much was left to members of her court. A prelate, for instance, received 400 gold florins, a knight 300, a page 200. To her loved lady of honor, Clara, she gave a village, a carriage and 6 horses, 400 silver marks, and her second prayer book, which on Clara's death was to go to the nuns of Buda. Everything remaining after this specified division, all jewels, cups, clothes, furniture, and 1,000 gold florins, were to be divided equally among the women of the Hungarian and Polish courts. In addition, pages and courtiers who had no appointments were to receive 1,000 florins each and her horses, except the 6 reserved for her funeral. She left much, too, to the Franciscan, Dominican, and Augustinian cloisters in Hungary, and to various churches. And finally, she appealed to her daughter-in-law. Elizabeth was one of the executors of her will, to be good to all the women of her court, and to Louis to be equally kind to the men. The will had been written in April, indicating that thus early she suspected the approach of the end and made her preparations. From all parts of Europe, condolences came by courier post to Buda, and they were by no means perfunctory. People knew that in no small measure Louis owed his success to Elizabeth. They recalled many an incident revealing the unusual relationship between Queen Mother and King. Some still smiled, remembering his letter to the Czech king, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles IV, who, during a controversy with Hungary over a demand for indemnities for Czech border robberies, had said, "It is too bad that King Louis allows his mother, using an unlovely epithet, to mix too much in government." Louis had at once demanded a duel, either with the emperor himself or between mutual representatives, and the demand being refused, had announced that he would arrive with an army to avenge the insult. In the meantime, he wrote, "We, Louis, by God's grace, King of Hungary, to one who calls himself King of the Czechs, send the greetings he deserves. Who offends the source of honor does not deserve to be honored. Who cannot control himself ought not to control others. Can you rule over territories who cannot rule over your own bad tongue? What manner of king are you, whose king, wine, leads you to dishonor a lady whom the whole world respects? did you but think of yourself as born of the honest womb of your mother, you would respect women and not speak thus of them. Had you lived virtuously, you would not thus in drunkenness defame her majesty, my mother. I command you to take back your calumny, and before all to praise my mother to the extent that you have slandered her. Otherwise, you will feel our revenge, for we will defend our mother's honor and our own honor." Here sounded the note of his vigorous devotion. What would Louis do without his mother? No one thought that his wife could take his mother's place in council or in practical participation in his government. Yet it was but natural that Elizabeth should now rejoice in her chance to win the position so long held by her mother-in-law. For the moment, her first desire must have been to comfort the king and to provide for Jadwiga and Mary some relief from the gloom of the Black Court mourning. One of their favorite diversions was the trip to St. Margaret's Island. St. Margaret's story touched them all concretely. Her father, the Magyar king Bela IV, had built their home, the Visegrad Tower Palace, in her memory, the queen giving her jewels to help. Later, the Church of St. Margaret and the cloisters of the Dominican nuns on this neighboring island had risen to commemorate her renunciation, for she had left the glamour and ease of her father's court to become a nun, and had so devoted her life to holy works that ever since her death, miracles had been wrought in her name. Her island was one of the best-loved pilgrimage spots of Europe. Entire villages had sprung up on it. In Jadwiga's imagination, so quickly stirred by mystical beauty, St. Margaret must have been especially glorified. She herself had been named after the Polish saint Jadwiga, who lived in the preceding century. Scribe John often narrated to his pupils the story of St. Margaret's progress, and with each telling re-stressed its moral that service is the highest aim of life. He was always endeavoring to build for them a historical background for the ideal of sacrifice, for his presentation of life as a passing spectacle, in which the only enduring things are won from contemplation and dedication of oneself to others. We can picture Queen Elizabeth, then, as taking Jadwiga and William and Mary and Sigismund away from the mourning court on an excursion to the island. She had her own miniature reception palace there, as King Louis and the Archbishop of Esztergom and others had theirs. And to its comfortable plastered chamber with the corner fireplace she first conducted her troop. This was not too easy, for they would have postponed prayers for an immediate excursion down half the mile length of the island, past the Franciscan monastery to the hot sulfur springs. There it was fascinating to watch steam and hot water welling apparently directly from the cold Danube. The island seemed but floating on the river. After refreshing themselves in the palace, in through the golden portal of the church they went, and kneeling on the red marble pavement, told their beads before the white marble altar and the low grave of St. Margaret. A service was in progress, and they knew that the sisters were following it from behind the windows of the oratorium beyond. There was something movingly mysterious about the complete invisibility of these nuns, who were hovering all about, following everything from all sorts of apertures. When the service was ended, they crossed the cloister-surrounded court, abloom with centifoglia roses and lilies, stopping, as they always did, to admire the fountain, whose waters flowed with 9 marble shells, where 9 at a time the nuns could separately wash their hands. Then they continued to the refectory. There, after washing their own hands in the lava basin at the entrance, they hungrily settled themselves on the board-covered stone benches following the walls, before the heaps of sandwiches and cakes piled on the long narrow tables. As they ate, Queen Elizabeth described the way in which at mealtimes the youngest nuns ate first, and the prioress, emulating the humility of St. Margaret, last, observing that, of course, being polite, the novices always restrained their natural appetites and left the best for their superior. The refectory was heated by hot air so that it was always comfortable, as was the hospital which the Queen now went to inspect, and where she comforted the sick who had come from far and near, with her faith in St. Margaret's power and in the virtues of the waters to cure them. While she was there, the young people were at last free to bathe and swim. In the late afternoon, when they reluctantly made ready to return, the great bronze bell of the church was ringing. They knew its inscription, "Help us, God and Mary." us simple people.